Hello, lords and ladies. Today we're going to talk about Sparta, the mighty Greek city-state. A little Greek music gets you in the mood. You see the Spartan soldier in his uniform and his shield. Not exactly the manliest, but definitely didn't want to mess with a Spartan. Okay, let's take a look at Sparta. Sparta is on the Peloponnesus, which is that large peninsula that I showed you guys on the map yesterday. At first it started as a pretty small town. Again, the Peloponnesus is a peninsula. It wasn't a super large or really densely populated area. They were actually quite small. And what they started to do is take over all of the towns around Sparta. One of those towns was Messenia. And when they took the Messenians, they actually made them become their slaves. Kind of interesting. They did this even though the Messenians greatly outnumbered the Spartans. And so when they brought them back and gave them to the citizens and asked them what you want them to do and had them work for them mostly on their property, what they didn't seem to take into account is how many more of them there were. And once they became slaves, they were called the Helots. And the Helots were outnumbering the Spartan citizens. So they had to come up with a way of keeping order in their society. Now, if you know much about Sparta, you probably already know that it is a very warlike city-state. And part of the reason for that is the fact that they did take these Messenians as their Helots, their slaves, and they needed a way to keep the greater population from actually rebelling and overtaking them. A great fear of any kind of slave owner. So what they did was twofold. One, you got slaves who can do all the work for you, so you can spend all of your time training to be a good little soldier. On top of that, it helps you keep order among those people who you've now conquered and made your slaves. And so that's really where their emphasis for war and trying to be very strong came from. The fact that they viewed it as the way to keep order in their society and keep these Helots from overtaking them. This allowed them to keep a strong army and keep those Helots in check, but it also kind of paved the way for what they're going to do in their future years. So you obviously saw that in the clip hopefully, that they very much valued strength and military prowess. And so from birth, children were judged. And basically if you were weak or sickly or anything like that, Mom would literally take you to the mountain and either drop you off or just abandon you there and leave you there to die. So from birth, that was expected, that you were strong, particularly if you're male, but also if you're female. Boys are taught by their mother until they're about 7 years old, at which point they're taken, and then they are put into school and they learn how to fight. Young women will have to take gymnastics and other fighting type exercises in order to maintain that toughness on the female side as well. Otherwise, the women would not have these strong children in their eyes. At age 20, the boys became hoplites, which means that they were foot soldiers in the army. They would have to stay in the army for at least 10 years, but typically they would have to stay until they were 60. So about 40 years of their lives they were expected to be in the military. So that's a very long time. Again, women were valued in this society more so in the sense that they were going to have the sons that would be the soldiers. So they had to be strong as well. They were trained in gymnastics, and to show some respect to the women, they also were allowed to own property, which is more than what we've seen in other areas of Greece, Minoa, Minos and on Crete and with the Mycenaeans. So these later societies, you do see, at least in Sparta, a little bit more respect for the females. But when we get to Athens, you'll see that that's a different story. In terms of their government, in the beginning they were led by 2 different kings, each one serving as military commander. That shows you the strength of the military and how really important it was in Spartan's life. But also, it shows that they did not necessarily want one leader, because they did not want one leader who would be corrupt. What happens over time, though, is as the military gets more and more entrenched in warfare, fighting with Persia and Thebes and all of these other areas of the world, they, particularly Greece, Sparta and Athens and Sparta and Thebes and these other areas fighting each other, they kind of decentralize their government in a way, and they elect a council of elders who then make the decision. So several older men involved in that process, and that's how you see their government evolve over time. In terms of Sparta, they are like the other Greeks, and all of the Greeks kind of explain the world through all sorts of myths. They have gods that represent, how they came to be, how they lived their lives, and kind of to explain the ideas of the afterlife and anything that people weren't certain about. And so these myths came to be regarded as truth. So according to Greek mythology, there is a mountain, Olympus, and that is the home of the gods. That's where the gods are housed, where their seat is. The gods of Olympus, there are many of them. And if you look at Greek religion, you're talking about hundreds of gods and goddesses. They typically are related to nature or to some kind of life or emotion, anything that has to do with people and humans living. For example, you have several of them. You have Ares, who is the god of war. He is the patron god of Sparta, whereas Athena, the goddess of wisdom, is the patron goddess of Athens. So what you'll see is that each of the city-states takes on one of these gods as their patron god. Some of the examples that we have are Apollo. He's the god of the sun and music. Hera is the god of marriage. Artemis is the god of the moon and the hunt. Hades is the god of death, the underworld. Ares is the god of war. Athena is wisdom. We talked about them, the patron gods of both Athens and Sparta. Demeter is the goddess of fertility. Hestia is hearth and home. Aphrodite is the goddess of love. Hermes is the god of travel. Zeus is the chief god. He is the god of the skies, and he creates the storm. So he is looked at as the chief god. And Poseidon is the god of the sea. So these are just a few of them. Obviously, there's hundreds of them. Zeus is married to Hera. Hera is, again, the goddess of marriage. They had a lot of arguments between them, and so they're not necessarily the best example of a marriage, but Poseidon, as god of the sea, is quick to get angry, but he doesn't always think through what he's doing first, so he will sometimes make very rash decisions. Now, Athens, had Athena. Corinth is Apollo. We know that Sparta is Ares. So these different city-states take on a god as their patron god, and then they try to, they pick someone who models what they believe in for their life. And so that's where you see them choosing these patron gods and goddesses. And there's lots of wonderful stories, and we'll look at some of these together in the coming days. And I'm sure you've done this a lot in English, so some of it for you guys will be repeating, and hopefully just bolstering what you already know, which is nice to see the relationship between both subjects. So, when you look at some of these gods, none of the ones listed here, I guess. Well, Aphrodite, you'll hear sometimes people talk about in terms of love and things like that. Maybe Poseidon with the sea, I've heard that before. Ares with war a little bit. But you'll hear about Achilles, you'll hear about Sisyphus, you'll hear about all of these other people from mythology that we've kind of coined terms from. Atlas with the world on his shoulders and things like that. So a lot of the things that we still talk about today, do come from some of these Greek myths, which is interesting, like having an Achilles heel and things like that. So, you can still see some of the influence of these Greek mythological figures today, and just the terms that we use for certain things they come from. I'm going to try and incorporate a clip here that you can just watch a little bit about the Mount Olympus gods.